Hello! Now my job today is to try and convince you of my argument that this is the best M3 that BMW has ever made, or perhaps more accurately, the best M3 BMW ever will make. What, really better than an E30? Better than an E36 GT? Better than an E46 CSL? Better even than the E90 GTS? Yes, I honestly think so, even with that controversial turbocharged engine and the famously spiky handling. In fact, because of that controversial turbocharged engine and the famously spiky handling. Now, what's the car we have here? This is the M3 CS, which is the kind of traditional run out to any M3 generation and kind of an amalgamation of the best bits that BMW has developed over that particular era. Now, of course, with the F80, we have the M4, which is the coupe, and the M3, which is the saloon. It gets a bit confusing swapping between the terms, so forgive me if I just default to using M3 as a kind of catch-all description. To my mind, the M3 is actually the better looking of the two as well. The M4 looks great, but to accommodate the coupe's wider rear axle with its M-active differential and all that kind of stuff, and put that on the saloon body, they had to create that kind of wide arch look, and I think it just gives the saloon a much meaner stance, a much more kind of hunkered down and aggressive look. It's just, to my mind, the best looking car, and it's the one that's still called the M3 and kind of links back to that incredible heritage that we all love so much. What makes a CS a CS? Well, as I say, it's kind of a combination of all the best bits that we've seen in all the different M3s and M4s over the last few years. So, starting with M3 Saloon, it gets a lot of the competition packages upgrades. That car went from the standard 431 horsepower to 450. This one actually has 460, so it's got a bit of extra power. It's got the competition packages, revised suspension, traction control and diff settings, so that's good. They make a big difference to the car, improved it a lot when they brought those changes in. Here you'll see we've got the slatted bonnet, it's actually carbon fibre, that's from the GTS. We have carbon splitter on the front. We've got, shock horror, some actually nice wheels. These are, I think, a lot nicer than the horrible spidery forged ones that they put on the GTS and the competition package. We've got the carbon roof that you get on all M3s and M4s. We've got a little carbon lip spoiler at the back. We've got an M sports exhaust system. And as I say, it just basically wraps up all the stuff that we've loved in the M3 and M4 over the last few years into one celebratory run-out package. Let's have a look inside and see what you get in here. So it's much the same story, really. It's pretty conservative, isn't it? It's quite black and sombre, but it's got some nice little touches. You get your little CS badge here, you get an Alcantara steering wheel, you get these fancy seats with their little cutouts and the M braiding on the seat belts. This one is a DCT, like most M3s and M4s. There was a manual, of course, but to my mind, this car actually works better with the Dct Gearbox. I'll explain a bit more about that once we get underway. And as I say, this is really just a best of compilation and a kind of celebratory farewell to the F80, M3 and M4. And I think it does a fantastic job of that. It should do. It's about an 85 grand car list. By the time you're done nearly 100 grand, that's a lot of money for an M3. Not quite as much as the GTS, which was, what, about 130, 140, wasn't it? But a lot of money for an M3. I think it lives up to it. As I say, I think it's the best M3 they've made yet. I think I need to demonstrate why out on the road, don't I? Okay, so spoiler alert, this isn't the best M3, despite what I might have said in the introduction. That car is the M3 CRT, which you may or may not have heard of, but is, I think, the most interesting example BMW ever made. What's the CRT? Well, it was based on the E90 M3 Saloon. It had the 4.4 litre Stroker V8 from the bright orange GTS, you know, the track focused one. And it had a load of lightweight bits, carbon fibre stuff derived from racing. And it's super rare. They only made 67, so it's rarer than the GTS. They're only left-hand drive, so you very rarely see them in the UK. And the fact it's based on a plain silver saloon, just to me makes it the coolest M3 that was ever made. Sorry, that's a fact. So that's the best M3 ever made. We're not talking about the CRT though, we're here to talk about the M3 CS, which I think is the best M3 of perhaps the F80 era, and arguably as a model, the F80 is the most interesting M3 of them all. Quite a few people will disagree with that. Let me try and talk you through why I think that's the case. Now then, we've all got to have a journey these days, haven't we? So my journey with the F80 starts with the launch, which was in Portimao, in Portugal, in blazing sunshine, on the track. And I did some huge skids in an M3 saloon, and I absolutely bloody loved it. I came back saying the car was fantastic. I fully bought in to the turbocharged engine and all the new technology. I drove a manual, which was difficult to get into because most of them were DCTs, and I actually came away thinking that the DCT was the better transmission for the car. Again, a controversial opinion, because purists will tell you that a manual is always best, but I think in a modern car like the M3, that the dual clutch gearbox is so embedded in the traction control, in everything, the differential, all these other systems, that really to get the most out of the car, DCT is where it's at. So that's how I came back from the launch. After that, I drove an M3 saloon in the UK in the depths of winter on slithery roads, much like the ones I'm on now, and I thought it was awful. It just felt like it was trying to kill me all the time. So the problem with that car was that the suspension just seemed to be all over the place, particularly on a wet road. There just wasn't a mode that worked. So my problem with it was that the comfort mode, which is the softer mode, just seemed hopelessly underdamped. And what that meant was that when you combine that with a really powerful rear-wheel drive car, if you go over a little crest on a constant throttle and there isn't enough damping, you're constantly varying how much contact pressure there is in the tyre, and the load going through the tyre was just constantly fluctuating, which meant on a greasy road, under power, you go over a bump and the thing is all over the place. And even with the stability systems on, an M3 is a pretty feisty car. So I came away from that pretty disappointed. And then I was lucky enough to run a long-termer for about 6 months and 10,000 miles. And that I completely fell in love with. It was LOVE love. I just adored that car. It was the kind of car where when you go to a filling station and you're queuing up to pay at the till, you're looking out the window all dreamy, looking at your car, to the point where the person behind the till goes, "Mate, are you actually going to pay for this fuel, or are you just going to stand there looking at your car?" So yes, I absolutely love that car. And I think the reason I fell for it so much was that it was complicated, and that's what I really like about the F80 era M3. They are not easy cars to get along with. They are not easy cars to drive fast. They are demanding. They don't reveal themselves to you in the first few miles. To be honest, even after 10,000 miles, I was still learning that car and learning how to drive it properly and learning how to get the most out of it, learning how to enjoy it the most, learning things like which combination of modes were the best. And the very fact it was imperfect and difficult and challenging to drive is what, to me, made it really exciting. And even after all those miles, there were still adventures to be had in that car, and it just was such an entertaining car to live with. I absolutely loved it, as I think you'll probably get the impression. Since then, I've driven C63, S, and the Alfa Romeo Giulia Quadrifoglio, competitor cars. We drove them all on the same day. And although I love the AMG, it's a real muscle car, it's got more power, it's probably a better all-rounder. And the Alfa Romeo showed signs of brilliance before breaking down. Although it was the least powerful, the M3 was the one that we all just loved the most. It was just it's a fierce car. Basically, if you want the F80 M3 described in one word, it's badass. This is not a car that makes it easy to get on with. So, if you like your driving and if you relish a challenge, that's what makes this car such an intoxicating machine. Now, what were the things that people didn't like? I think it was interesting because when people group tested this car, I think road testers who had a week with it or a shorter time frame didn't really have time to kind of bond with it or understand its quirks. And that's why it tended to do quite badly in group tests and things like that. Those of us who ran them as long-termers, lucky enough to run them as long-termers, had time to kind of learn about the car and evolve with them. And I think it was interesting to see that in group tests and things like that, the M3 and M4 tended to do pretty badly. People who ran them as long-termers tended to love them. And I think that says a lot about the character of the car. But as I say, what was it people didn't like? The damping, I've already talked about that. It wasn't perfect. The engine, they said, was a bit soulless, didn't sound very nice, didn't have a very nice throttle response and all the rest. So let's deal with that. Sound. So my M4, I'll agree, it didn't sound very nice. I managed to find a fix for that. I unplugged the horrible fake noise things in the boot. After that, it sounded a lot better. This car has a different exhaust system, and again, sounds a lot more natural to me, a lot more interesting. Throttle response, I think this engine with its 2 turbos and all the clever booster circulation, all that kind of thing, yeah, it's not as sharp as the old V8, but it's sharp enough, and it's got mid-range and it's got top end, it's got everything, and it loves revs. It absolutely loves revs. I think, to be honest, if you're saying this engine is boring or doesn't have character, there's a very simple answer to that. You're not driving it fast enough. So, simple solution to enjoying the F80 M3 and M4, get your foot in and hold on tight. To me, the engine this most reminds me of is the RB26 Det in those classic R32, 33 and 34 Skylines. That is arguably one of the best engines ever made, one of the most characterful, not lacking in power. You never hear anybody complaining about that, and yet they share a similar format, don't they? Straight sixes, twin turbos, 3 litres-ish. Yeah, I think this is like a Skyline engine in a really exciting rear-wheel drive car. What's not to like, people? There we go, there's the passionate version. So, the engine, yes, not everybody got on with it, but the other interesting thing about the M3 is, obviously a lot of car manufacturers have had this kind of painful emotional shift from being naturally aspirated to turbocharged, different engine formats, downsizing, all the rest of it. BMW never really had that with the M3, doesn't there? There's no kind of consistent lineage with M3 engines. We've had 4-cylinder screamers, we've had refined straight 6 in the E36, we've had raucous straight 6 in the E46, we've had V8, and now twin turbo. So people getting hung up on this supposed kind of trashing the legacy, I don't buy that either. I think it's fine for the M3 to have a turbocharged engine, particularly one as exotic and as exciting as this. As for this particular car, I think the reason I love this one so much is that it kind of answers a lot of the niggles, because as I say, much as I liked my M4, it wasn't perfect and there were things that it could have done better. And over the lifespan of the F80, BMW has tweaked around the edges and come up with some modifications which I do think have addressed some of the major concerns. So steering in this one feels a lot better. There's a bit of feedback to it. It's still an electric rack. It's not the best, but then, to be honest, BMW systems never really have, or not for a long time anyway. So there's a sense of what's going on in the front end. The damping, as I say, is way better. The big difference in this car is that you can run it in comfort on a really bumpy road like this, and those little kind of fluctuations and kind of stutter bumps that would so unsettle the older cars now just get flattened out and dealt with so much more convincingly, to the point where you can drive it aggressively in the comfort mode and it's really not a problem. It feels, it's got flow now, whereas before it felt like it was in mortal combat with the road and having a fight and basically trying to bin you through the bushes at every possible opportunity. Now it actually feels like it's working with the road, and the tweaks to the stability control and the gearbox and the diff and things like that just make it, they haven't dumbed it down, but they've just taken some of the more psychotic edge off the car to the point where you can actually use and enjoy its abilities a bit more. So it's got a broader operating range now, whereas before The M3 and M4 were great on a dry road, great on a smooth road, but pretty awful on a wet, bumpy one. Now this is a car you can enjoy in all conditions on all roads. It's still a handful, and that's another reason I love this car so much. It makes absolutely no apologies. It gives you nowhere to hide. If you can't drive, if you're one of these binary on-off the throttle types, you are going to hate this car, because it's going to be either you're going to be in a blaze of stability control interventions, or you're going to be spinning off at the first roundabout. So unless you can learn to modulate the throttle and the brakes and everything else and balance the car, you're really not going to get along. And that's why I like it so much, because it assumes a level of competence and it doesn't come down to the level of average drivers. It is at its level, and you have to meet that. And if you're willing to do that, if you're willing to commit to that, then there's a fantastic car there. And that's what I keep coming back to, is that the longer you spend with this car, the more it reveals to you and the more enjoyable it becomes and the more depth you get out of it. So you're probably detecting a level of enthusiasm here for the F80 M3 that you may not have heard before, because I think it is a truly underrated car, and I think it really does mark the end of an era. Is it the best M3 ever? Well, I'm sure you'll tell me what you think in the comments below. One thing I think we can be certain of, it's better than the next M3 will be, because I can't see how BMW can build another car as wild and challenging as this. So in that respect, yes, this is the best M3 there has been.